They made a mistake the moment they decided I wasn't worth respecting. What they didn't know was that I'd been trained to wait. My name is Zara Okonkwo Petite, and I am a corporal with the Canadian Armed Forces, currently on administrative leave pending a commendation review. That last part is important. Remember it. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, the daughter of a man who drove long-haul trucks between the Nickel Belt and the Quebec border, and a mother who cleaned offices overnight so I could take piano lessons I never asked for. We weren't poor, exactly, but we knew what it felt like when the heat got shut off in February. We knew what it felt like to choose between groceries and the hydro bill. We knew the weight of things, my family. That weight made me strong. I joined the forces at 19, not because I had no options. I had a partial scholarship to Laurentian that I turned down. I joined because I wanted to build something with my body, with my discipline, with my own two hands. I wanted to earn something that couldn't be taken back. My father cried at my basic training graduation. My mother pressed her face into the crook of my neck and didn't say a single word. She didn't have to. I met my husband Sebastian at a mess dinner in Petawawa. He was there as a civilian guest of a friend. His family had deep roots in the officer community, even though Sebastian himself never enlisted. His father was a retired lieutenant colonel. His grandfather had served in Korea. The family name, Marchetti Fontaine, carried a certain gravity in certain rooms. Sebastian had grown up inside that gravity, without ever having to earn it himself, which I would only understand later. He was charming and funny, and he looked at me like I was the most interesting person in the room. I was in uniform that night. He said it suited me. I believed him. We dated for 14 months. He drove up to Petawawa on weekends, when I wasn't on exercise. We talked on the phone until 2 in the morning. He came to my sister's wedding in Sudbury, and danced badly and made my aunties laugh. I thought I knew him. I thought I knew his family. His mother, Colette, lived in Westmount. If you're not from Montreal, you might not understand what that means. Westmount is old money and stone houses, and a particular kind of French-English bilingual privilege that wears itself like a second skin. Colette spoke English with a deliberate accent, not because she couldn't speak it fluently. She absolutely could, but because the accent communicated something she wanted to communicate. She wore blazers indoors. She served wine at lunch without asking if you wanted any. She had opinions about everything and offered them as facts. The first time I met her, I was in civilian clothes. She looked me over once, smiled with only the top half of her face, and said, in French to Sebastian, that I seemed bien simple. Well put together. Simple. Like a compliment folded around a judgment. Sebastian translated it as, "She thinks you look great." I didn't correct him. I spoke enough French to know exactly what his mother had said. His sister, Anouk, was 3 years younger than Sebastian and had never worked a day in her life that anyone could confirm. She had a lifestyle blog, some vague involvement in her mother's interior design contacts, and a boyfriend named Felix who wore scarves indoors and talked about wine the way some people talk about God. Anouk had Colette's same smile, top half only, and she used it on me every single time we were in the same room. The first Christmas I spent with the Marchetti Fontaines, Anouk asked me, across the dinner table, what it was like to take orders for a living. I said it was a lot like running a household, except the stakes were higher and you actually got paid. Sebastian laughed. Colette did not. His father, Girard, was a different matter. He was quiet in the way that some men are quiet when they've seen things they don't talk about. He shook my hand firmly the first time we met. He asked about my regiment, about my trade. I'm a signals operator. And he listened to my answers with his full attention. He said once, over coffee, that the people who actually served were rarely the loudest ones in the room. I thought he was on my side. I wasn't entirely wrong about that. I just didn't understand the shape of his loyalty yet. Sebastian and I got married in June, 2 years after we met. City Hall ceremony in Montreal, Dinner after at a restaurant in the plateau that his mother had not approved of and told us so. My parents drove down from Sudbury. My father wore his best suit. My mother brought homemade puff pastry, wrapped in a tea towel, because she didn't trust restaurant food at reception. Colette arrived 40 minutes late and announced loudly that the decor was interesting. Anouk posted a photo of herself from that evening and captioned it, "Celebrating family," without tagging me or mentioning it was my wedding. I loved Sebastian. I want to be clear about that. I loved him, and for a long time I believed that loving him meant absorbing everything that came with him. My deployment order came 9 months after we married. 6 months in Latvia, with a NATO mission. Not combat, officially, but the Baltic situation had enough tension that nobody was pretending it was a vacation. Sebastian drove me to the airport. He held on too long at the gate. He said he'd call every night. He said he'd be fine. He said his mother had offered for him to stay in the Westmount house while I was away to save money, and that it made sense logistically. I said okay. That was the mistake I made. Not the only one, but the first one. He moved into the Westmount house 2 weeks after I left. He brought our cat, Chips, which I had not been consulted about, and which became, for some reason I still can't fully articulate, the thing that bothered me most in the early weeks. Chips hated Colette on sight, which told me everything I needed to know about my cat's character. I called when I could. The time difference between Latvia and Montreal is 6 hours, which meant our calls happened either very early in the morning for me or very late at night for him. Sebastian always sounded a little distracted. I chalked it up to being back in his mother's house, back in that orbit. I should have paid closer attention to the orbit. About 2 months in, I started hearing things in his voice. Smaller things. He stopped asking about my work. He started passing on things Colette had said, then catching himself, then changing the subject. Once, when I mentioned that my master corporal had approved my application for a technical course after the deployment, he said, "Is that really the direction you want to keep going?" I asked him what he meant. He said, "Mom was just saying never mind." I asked him to finish the sentence. He didn't. I finished my deployment in late February. The flight home connected through Frankfurt, and then Toronto, and then Montreal, and I was in transit for 22 hours, and by the time I landed I was running on 4 hours of sleep and 6 months of accumulated longing for my own bed, and my own kitchen, and my own life. I didn't tell Sebastian my exact arrival time. Our messaging had gotten patchy in the last 2 weeks, and I wanted to surprise him. I did not anticipate that I would be the one surprised. I took a cab from Trudeau Airport, directly to the Westmount house, because that is where my husband was. It was a Saturday afternoon. Late February in Montreal means dirty gray snow along the curbs and that particular quality of light that is somehow both bright and bleak. I paid the driver, pulled my kit bag up the front steps, and rang the bell because I didn't have a key to his mother's house and had never been given one. Anouk answered the door. She looked at me the way you look at someone trying to sell you something on your front step. She didn't move to let me in. "Zara," she said. Not a greeting, an identification. I said I was there for Sebastian. She said he wasn't home. I said I'd wait inside. She said it wasn't a good time. I said, with the full weight of 6 months away and a NATO posting in my voice, that I was fairly certain it was a fine time, and that I would like to wait inside for my husband in my mother-in-law's house. She stepped back but didn't open the door wider. I had to turn sideways to get my kit bag through. Colette was in the sitting room. She was holding a glass of white wine at 2 in the afternoon, which I noted, and she was watching me cross the threshold with an expression I can only describe as proprietary. Like I was entering a space where I did not have clearance. I said hello. I asked if Sebastian was expected back soon. She said, "We weren't expecting you." I said I had wanted to surprise him. She said, "Sebastian has been settling in very nicely here. I think the space has been good for him." I didn't say anything to that. I set my kit bag down by the door and asked if I could have a glass of water. Anouk brought me tap water in a short glass, no ice, and set it on the coffee table without looking at me. I sat down on the edge of the settee that Colette had always treated as her personal territory. I did that deliberately. I sat on the edge of that settee with my back straight, still in my uniform. I hadn't had a chance to change, and I drank my tap water and waited. Colette started talking. She had a way of talking that wasn't quite a monologue and wasn't quite a conversation. She talked about how well Sebastian had been doing. She talked about a dinner party she had hosted for some of his former colleagues. She talked about a potential business opportunity that some of the family's contacts had surfaced, something in commercial real estate, something that would require stability, groundedness, commitment to the city. I said, "That's interesting," she said. "Sebastian has a great deal of potential. He always has. It requires the right environment." I said, "I know, I married him." There was a pause. Anouk made a small sound from across the room. Not quite a laugh. Not quite not a laugh. Then Colette said something I have replayed in my mind every day since. She said, "I do sometimes wonder, Zara, whether this," she gestured vaguely at my uniform, "whether this life is the right fit for the family. Whether it's the right fit for Sebastian. He needs someone present, someone rooted." I said, "I've been serving our country," she said. "Yes, but Sebastian has needs." There was a silence that had texture to it. I set my glass down. I looked at her directly and I said, "Where is my husband?" That was when Anouk stood up. Later, when I tried to describe what happened next to my MCPL, I couldn't fully reconstruct the sequence because it happened fast, and because I was running on no sleep, and the disorientation of re-entry, and the slow-building horror of understanding what kind of conversation I had actually walked into. Anouk walked toward me and said something in French too fast for me to catch all of it, but the word I caught was in Din. Unworthy. She said I was unworthy. Then she spat on my uniform. Not on me. On the uniform, on the rank insignia on my chest. I stood up, Colette said, sharply. Anouk said, in English, loud and clear, "She doesn't belong here. She has never belonged here. Sebastian knows it. We all know it." I was standing very still. There is a training they put you through. Not formally, not in any manual, but through repetition and pressure and being screamed at by people with authority. Until the screaming stops registering as threat and starts registering as information. I was applying that training. I was cataloging. I was staying level. I said very quietly, "You just spat on a service member's uniform." Anouk laughed. Actually laughed. She said, "You're in my mother's house. You're nobody's service member here." Colette had gone very still. She was watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Not horror exactly, not approval, something calculating. I said, "I'd like you to apologize." Anouk said, "I'd like you to leave." That was when the door from the hallway opened. Gerard walked in first. He took in the room, me standing, uniform marked, Anouk flush with adrenaline, Colette rigid on her settee, in about 2 seconds. His face did something that I had never seen it do before. It closed. Behind him was Sebastian. Sebastian, who was supposed to be not home. Sebastian, who looked at me across that sitting room, with an expression that cracked something open in the center of my chest. Not because it was cold, but because it was guilty. He knew something I didn't know yet. He had known it for a while. And behind Sebastian was a man in uniform. A JAG officer. Judge Advocate General's Corps, Canadian Armed Forces. I recognized the insignia. His name tag said Tremaine. He was carrying a file folder. Gerard said, without preamble, "Colette, sit down." She sat. Whatever authority existed in that room, Gerard had just claimed all of it. Gerard looked at Anouk. He said, "What happened here?" Anouk said, "Nothing. Family conversation," he said. "There is spit on your sister-in-law's uniform." Silence. He looked at me. He said, "Corporal Okonkwo Petit. Are you all right?" I said. "I'm fine, sir." He nodded once. Then he looked at Sebastian and said, "Tell her." Sebastian looked at the floor. He looked at his hands. He looked briefly at his mother. Then he looked at me and he said that he had retained a lawyer 6 weeks ago, that he had been in discussions with the family about the direction of the marriage, that Colette had been. And he stopped and started again, that he had been receiving advice about his long-term prospects, about what the family felt was sustainable. I said, 6 weeks ago. He said, "I'm sorry, Zara. I had been in Latvia. I had been in a signals tent in Adagi in the February cold, running communications infrastructure for a NATO mission, thinking about my husband, for 6 weeks. While I was doing that, my husband had been sitting in his mother's sitting room, letting his family talk him into something." Captain Tremaine stepped forward. He introduced himself. He said he was there on my behalf, that Gerard had contacted the JAG office 3 days prior, having become aware of certain conversations happening in the household, and had requested that a legal representative be present when I returned home. 3 days. Gerard had known for at least 3 days that his son was planning something, and he had made a phone call to the Judge Advocate General's office on my behalf, without telling Sebastian, without telling Colette. I looked at Gerard. He looked back at me. He said quietly, "You served, that means something." It was not an apology for his family. It was not a reversal of anything. It was simply a man who had spent 30 years understanding what the uniform meant, doing the one thing he could do. The next hours were long and procedural, and I will not relive all of them here. What I will tell you is this. Sebastian had signed nothing yet. The lawyer his family had retained had given him documents to review, but he had not signed them. Captain Tremaine made this very clear, and also made clear what the implications would be if Sebastian chose to proceed, including the provisions under the Divorce Act that applied to a spouse who had been absent for military service reasons, and including the fact that Anouk's act of spitting on a service member's uniform was documented by me the moment it happened, on the small notebook I carry on my person at all times. "Training," Colette said. "At one point, this is a family matter." Gerard said, "It became a legal matter when your daughter spat on a corporal's uniform inside my house." Anouk said nothing after that. I did not stay in the Westmounts house that night. Captain Tremaine connected me with a colleague who arranged temporary accommodation through the base support network. There are systems for this, for service members in transitional situations, and I was grateful for them in a way I had never anticipated needing to be. I took a shower. I slept for 11 hours. I called my mother in Sudbury and told her I was home, and I was okay, and I would explain everything later. She said she already knew something was wrong because a mother knows. Then she said she was making me pierogies, and she would drive them down on Saturday, and I said okay. Sebastian called the next morning. He said he was sorry. He said he had let himself get turned around. He said his family had a way of making things seem certain that weren't certain, and he had spent so long in that house that he'd lost the thread of what he actually wanted. He said he didn't want to lose me. He said he'd been a coward. I listened to all of it. I said, "I believe that you're sorry. I don't know yet what that means for us." And that was the truth. The complete, unglamorous truth. There was no clean resolution that night, no moment where everything snapped back into place. That is not how these things work. That is not how any of this works. What I know is this: I came home from serving my country, in uniform, and I was spat on in a sitting room in Westmount. I stood my ground. I did not yell. I did not threaten. I did not lower myself to anything I would have been ashamed of later. I took out my notebook, and I wrote down the time and the date, and what had happened, the way I had been trained to document events in the field. And then a retired lieutenant colonel, who had watched his family go sideways, made one phone call. One quiet, decisive phone call. And the entire thing shifted. Gerard called me a week later. He said he was sorry for what had happened in his house. He said he should have intervened sooner and that he had failed to recognize how far things had drifted. He said he was proud of my service. He said that word, proud, without flinching or qualifying it, or folding it inside something smaller. He said it straight. I thanked him. I meant it. My mother brought the perogies on Saturday. We ate them at the kitchen table of the small apartment I was renting month to month near Côte des Neiges. She looked around the place with the particular expression of a mother cataloging how her child is actually doing, versus how her child is claiming to be doing. Then she nodded once and poured herself tea and asked me to tell her everything. So I did. I told her all of it. I did not leave out the hard parts. I told her about standing in that sitting room in my uniform, with the spit drying on my chest insignia, staying level, taking out my notebook. Which is her greatest gift, and the thing I have always known she gave me. The ability to listen to something hard without flinching. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father and I didn't raise you to fold." I said, "No, you didn't." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Outside, it was March in Montreal, which means the snow was starting to gray at the edges, starting to pull back from the curbs, starting to let the city remember that it had a ground beneath it all along. I didn't know yet what my marriage would become. I didn't know what Sebastian would choose when it came down to it. So when the house in Westmount and his mother's certainty and his own guilt were all laid out in front of him, and he had to make an actual decision. I didn't know any of that yet, but I knew who I was. I had always known who I was. That is the thing they miscalculated. Every one of them, in that sitting room, with their wine at 2 p.m, and their French that they didn't think I could follow, and their smiles that stopped at the eyes. They looked at my uniform and they thought it made me less. They thought it made me a person who could be managed, contained, dismissed. They forgot what the uniform actually means. You don't wear it because you had connections. You don't wear it because your grandfather had a rank. You earn it. Every morning you earn it again, and the woman standing in front of them had been earning hers for 6 years, in training depots in Borden and signals tents in Adagi, and on the tarmac at Mirabel, at 6 a.m. With her kit bag over one shoulder and her country at her back, they made a fatal mistake. The moment they decided I wasn't worth respecting. I was already writing it down.